May 10, 1940, the pre-dawn quiet above the Netherlands, 0:30. The sound did not come as a thunderclap, but as a deep, metallic thrumming, the heartbeat of an approaching empire. German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, were descending from the cold, indifferent sky, their parachutes blooming like toxic night flowers over the unsuspecting lowlands. Below, Dutch citizens stirred, their lives about to collide with a tactical shockwave no one, least of all their own military high command, had fully anticipated. The strategic irony of the Netherlands was its neutrality. For decades, this small nation believed the simple declaration of non-alignment could shield it from the industrialized carnage sweeping the continent. This belief, however noble, was a monumental miscalculation, a vulnerability the German Wehrmacht planned to exploit with surgical precision. Their objective, not merely conquest, but speed. They needed to bypass the formidable French Maginot Line, and the flat, open terrain of the Netherlands offered the perfect, if unexpected, route for blitzkrieg. The initial defense strategy, the waterline of inundation, the rigid deployment of outdated artillery, was a relic of World War I thinking. It was designed to repel a slow, grinding frontal assault. What the Dutch commanders did not grasp, could not possibly have foreseen, was the radical transformation of warfare that had occurred since 1918. They were preparing for trenches. The Germans brought the terror of the skies and the speed of the tank. One engineer, a lieutenant in the Dutch Corps of Engineers named Gerrit, watched in disbelief as the first Junkers Ju-52 transport planes roared over the coastal defenses he was meticulously preparing. "We were taught the war would stop at the river," he recalled years later, the disbelief still heavy in his voice. "We had the bridges wired for demolition, but how do you wire the sky for demolition?" This was the central technological puzzle. The Netherlands was invaded by air, not by land. The Germans executed the first large-scale strategic airland operation in history, seizing crucial airfields like Walhaven and Ypenburg, and the key bridges across the Moerdijk and the Maas. The goal was to establish an airborne corridor, a technological and strategic bypass of all ground defenses, and secure the swift surrender of The Hague. The sheer scale of this opening move was staggering. The Germans committed nearly 4,000 Fallschirmjäger and hundreds of transport aircraft in the opening hours. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a demonstration of a new military doctrine. The traditional concept of a front line vanished. Suddenly, the front line was everywhere, in the civilian streets, on the rooftops, and in the quiet fields where farmers watched in horror as soldiers landed among their crops. The Dutch military, while fighting bravely, was structurally overwhelmed. Their air force, flying outdated Fokker-Die-Typhoons and GIs, was virtually wiped out in the first 2 days by the faster, better-armed Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Bf-110s. The strategic vacuum created by this rapid collapse of organized defense was total. By May 14th, following the brutal bombing of Rotterdam, a deliberate act of psychological terror using Heinkel, He-111 bombers that flattened the city center and killed nearly 900 civilians, the Dutch government was forced to sign the instrument of surrender. The nation was occupied. The war for the uniformed soldier was over. The war for the civilian was about to begin. The German High Command issued immediate directives. The populace must remain calm, comply, and return to work. They believed the Dutch were by nature compliant and pragmatic. They expected order and economic cooperation. What they did not know, could not possibly fathom, was that the very blitzkrieg that had crushed the conventional army had, in turn, unleashed a more resilient and far more complex enemy, the impossible spirit of the occupied people. This was the moment the seeds of the impossible stand were sown. The ensuing years would prove that the most potent weapon is not always steel or explosive, but the sustained, invisible refusal to submit. It is this shadow war, fought in silence and through daring acts of sabotage and deception, that defines their legacy. If the resilience of the human spirit against overwhelming technological force interests you, consider subscribing to our channel. Every week, we delve into the untold stories of Thibaut Poujou, where the impossible became reality. We rely on your support to uncover these hidden histories. The immediate aftermath of the May surrender was a landscape of psychological warfare and covert organization. The German occupation was swift, moving from tactical conquest to administrative control with cold efficiency. Their strategy, initially governed by Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, was to integrate the industrious Dutch economy into the German war machine, a key element of the Nazi strategic resource plan. Every factory, every shipyard, every rail line became a component in Hitler's grand design. But the very organizational efficiency the Germans prized became the resistance's first target. Unlike in larger occupied territories, the Netherlands was densely populated and tightly organized, traits that facilitated both quick control and, paradoxically, rapid clandestine communication. The underground movement, initially a collection of fragmented amateur cells, began to coalesce, driven by three core necessities: intelligence, sabotage, and survival. The intelligence component was paramount. Early groups like the LOD, Landelijke Organisatie voor Hulp aan Onderduikers, National Organization for Help to People in Hiding, and Vrij Nederland began as small, often dangerous networks focused on gathering and transmitting critical data. This was not the work of soldiers, but of telegraph operators, railway clerks, and university students. One major technological challenge for the resistance was communication under the oppressive German signal monitoring regime. The Germans deployed sophisticated direction-finding, DF technology, to trace illicit radio transmissions. The solution was the use of microtransmitters, small battery-operated units often built from salvage components, enabling short, rapid bursts of Morse code transmitted and received in seconds, earning them the nickname pianola radios due to their fast, frantic rhythm. "We knew a transmission lasting more than 2 minutes was a death sentence," recounted Aunt Corey, a former operator who survived the war. "The anxiety was constant. I would put the aerial out just as a train went by, hoping the noise would cover the tiny click of the key. It was a race against the direction finders." The German industrial demand became the fuel for the resistance's sabotage strategy. The rail networks, vital for moving troops and supplies to the Western Front and the Atlantic Wall, were a constant focus. Acts of sabotage were not always spectacular explosions, but often subtle strategic damage. Mislabeled components, intentionally flawed welds, or carefully placed sand in the bearings of critical machinery. This slow, systemic erosion of output was quantifiable by Allied intelligence. The most crucial and perhaps the most compassionate act of resistance was the creation of the underground passport, the Persoonsbewijs. This forgery network was a masterpiece of clandestine logistics involving printers, photographers, and government clerks who had access to official paper stock and ink. A genuine Dutch identity card was an absolute requirement for all citizens. Without it, one was subject to immediate arrest and deportation. The resistance successfully produced over 300,000 forged documents, creating an entire shadow population of divers, Onderdikers, Jews, Allied airmen, and young men evading forced labor. This massive feat of paper-based deception provided the infrastructure for the impossible stand. For the German security police, Sicherheitspolizei, the inability to contain this paper war was a constant source of frustration. They relied on meticulous bureaucratic control, and the forged documents rendered their system porous and unreliable. The Germans, in their rigid adherence to military logic, believed that terror was the ultimate deterrent. Executions like those carried out at the Walsdorfer Vlakte were intended to break the public will. What they failed to grasp was the historical irony that terror, when applied to a civilian populace, often acts as a catalyst for deeper, more entrenched resistance. The early disorganized attempts gave way to a hardened, dedicated apparatus. The amateur cells learned the techniques of espionage, the tradecraft of forgery, and the cold calculations of self-preservation. From the ashes of military defeat rose a determined civilian front, transforming the Netherlands from an occupied territory into a silent, contested battlefield, a shadow war fought not with tanks and planes, but with paper, radio waves, and sheer, bloody-minded courage. By the middle of 1942, the conflict had stabilized into a deadly equilibrium. The Germans controlled the economy and the infrastructure, but the resistance controlled the narrative and, crucially, the lifelines of the Onderdikers. This phase of the impossible stand was less about dramatic explosions and more about the immense, complex logistics of sustaining a clandestine society. It was a battle of supply lines. The German lines fueled the war machine, the resistance lines fueled survival. The sheer scale of the hiding population was a constant logistical nightmare. By 1944, over 300,000 people were living outside the official German registration system. Supplying them with food, clothing, and funds required a massive, coordinated effort known as the LO, Landliche Organisation. The LO functioned like a highly decentralized but robust distribution system. It was one of the greatest feats of non-military logistics in the war. The resistance needed to divert food ration coupons, Bonnen, from the official German supply chain. This was accomplished through daring raids on distribution offices, often executed by teams of young, unarmed civilians. These operations were called Bonnen raids. One such raid on a distribution office in Amsterdam yielded thousands of coupons. The risk was enormous, as Captain Klaus, a senior SD security service officer in The Hague, wrote in his 1943 report, "The Dutch people are not armed, but their organization is formidable. They raid the offices with the precision of experienced commandos. If we secure 1,000 ration books, they steal 1,001. The technological irony of the LO was its reliance on the very infrastructure the Germans controlled. Couriers, often young women or elderly cyclists who drew less suspicion, transported the stolen ration books across the country, using the same roads and railways that carried German troops and supplies. They used dead drops, coded messages embedded in classified ads, and personal high-risk handovers in crowded public places. Financing this operation was another massive challenge. The official Allied governments in exile provided some funding, but the primary source became the National Support Fund, National Steunfonds, NSF. The NSF, disguised as legitimate banking operations, effectively siphoned massive amounts of money from official Dutch banks, particularly the Nederlandsche Bank, transferring funds to the resistance through complex, untraceable transactions. This financial operation, masterminded by figures like Walraven van Hall, the banker of the resistance, was an act of economic warfare disguised as financial fraud. Van Hall ultimately funneled over 80 million Dutch guilders, a colossal sum at the time, to sustain the underground. The German response was a counterintelligence strategy focused on infiltration and starvation. They tried to track the movement of stolen coupons and monitored bank transactions for anomalies, but the decentralized nature of the LO, broken down into small compartmentalized cells, proved maddeningly resilient. If one cell was compromised, the others continued their work. The emotional toll on the civilians involved in this logistics network was immense. They faced the daily crushing fear of exposure, the constant need for deception, and the knowledge that one false move could condemn not only themselves, but the families they were sheltering. This human dimension of the logistical battle transformed ordinary clerks and housewives into strategic operators, administering a clandestine welfare state. The success of the LONSF was not measured in explosions, but in statistics of survival. By VE Day, the ability of the resistance to feed, hide, and fund a parallel society of hundreds of thousands proved that an organized civilian will, fueled by financial ingenuity and logistical dedication, could sustain itself indefinitely against the most brutal military and administrative occupation. Their stand was less an act of military revolt and more a prolonged logistical siege of the German will to control. It was the silent economic engine of resilience. The true strategic value of the impossible stand lay not in direct confrontation, but in the delivery of high-value intelligence to the Allied forces, a technological and operational effort fraught with unparalleled danger. This was the era of the spy, the secret code, and the relentless technological cat-and-mouse game against the German Abwehr and the SD. The primary conduit for intelligence was the network known as the Englandspiel, England game, and the subsequent, far more successful clandestine radio networks. Initially, the Germans achieved a monumental, devastating victory. The Abwehr, employing advanced radio direction-finding techniques and psychological exploitation, managed to capture and turn a significant number of Allied agents parachuted into the Netherlands from 1942 to 1943. They seized the Allied radio codes and for over a year transmitted false information to London, a deadly game of technological treachery that resulted in the capture and death of almost 50 agents. The historical irony here is profound. The resistance had to learn its tradecraft by surviving and eventually exposing a massive, fatal technological failure of Allied intelligence. The eventual revival and success of the Dutch intelligence network, such as the Pijlstaff Group, relied on several key technological countermeasures and immense personal bravery. 1. Code and cryptography. Post-Englandspiel, the agents adopted more robust one-time pad encryption methods. This system, mathematically unbreakable if executed correctly, relied on paper pads of random keys used only once. The challenge was logistics. The pads had to be physically delivered, often sewn into clothing or the linings of suitcases, demanding a perfect, trusting chain of command. 2. Radio operation. The pianola technique, the short, high-speed burst transmission, became essential. The operators learned the rhythms of the German direction finders and chose precarious, short-lived locations, church steeples, attic spaces, and even hollowed-out haystacks. The average lifespan of a radio operator was terrifyingly short, mere months. "The radio set was my umbilical cord to freedom and my coffin," wrote an unnamed operator in a recovered letter. Every key tap felt like a scream into the silence. You never knew if the static you heard was the wind or the German van pulling up outside. The intelligence delivered was often technical and tactical, crucial for Allied planning. For example, details on the construction of the Atlantic Wall, including the positioning and specifications of German coastal guns and obstacles, were mapped out by resistance members and transmitted back to London. This information was vital for the planning of the later landings in Normandy. Furthermore, the resistance provided early detailed information on German V weapons development. Reports on the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket program were transmitted from sites like Peenemünde and were instrumental in directing Allied bombing campaigns against these technological threats. The German counterintelligence, driven by the ruthlessness of the SD, used torture, informants, and sophisticated surveillance. The technological battle was mirrored by a psychological one. The constant fear of the V-man, Vertrauensmann or trusted manned informant, who had successfully infiltrated a resistance cell. In the end, the impossible stand became the unseen eyes and ears of the Allied High Command. The Dutch civilians, armed with little more than salvaged radio components and an unbreakable will, bridged the 300-mile gap across the North Sea, transforming the Netherlands from an occupied pawn into a critical, high-risk intelligence hub. This flow of information was the strategic lifeblood that validated the Allied belief that despite the military defeat, the spirit of the people was a force multiplier they could not afford to lose. As the war entered its final, brutal phase, the stakes for the resistance escalated dramatically. Increased German paranoia and the relentless pressure of the SD led to a period of maximum compromise. This chapter explores the ultimate calculation faced by every member of the impossible stand. The trade-off between the security of the network and the demands of operational necessity, often leading to acts of heroic self-sacrifice or, tragically, betrayal under duress. The German security services strategy was simple: target the leadership, exploit human weakness, and use public execution as a psychological tool. The statistics were chilling. By the end of the war, thousands of Dutch resistance members had been executed and tens of thousands imprisoned. The key to the German success in disrupting the networks lay in the interrogation techniques developed by the Gestapo and SD. They were not merely seeking names, they were seeking the architecture of the network, the financial pathways, the communication protocols, and the location of the printing presses. The resistance countered with rigorous adherence to the principle of compartmentalization, the need-to-know basis. A logistics runner knew only his drop-off point, a radio operator knew only his code recipient, and a forger knew only his paper source. However, the human element, the fear, the exhaustion, the loss, was the system's greatest vulnerability. The story of Anton, a courier who carried crucial Allied airmen's escape documents, illustrates this tragic equation. Caught in a routine street check, Anton faced immediate execution. Under interrogation, he maintained silence for 48 agonizing hours, buying enough time for his cell to scatter. His silence saved a dozen lives, costing him his own. His sacrifice was a deliberate final act of strategic asset protection. The terror was specifically directed at the support network for the Onderduikers. When discovered, hiding places were brutalized, and entire families sheltering Jews or Allied personnel were immediately sent to concentration camps. This elevated the moral stakes of the resistance to an impossible degree. Every forged ration book was a gamble with the lives of the host families. A critical technological point of conflict in this late war period was the growing need for Allied air support in support of the resistance, particularly for the final, catastrophic operation known as Operation Market Garden. Intelligence from the Dutch resistance was crucial for this operation, but the Germans, in response, tightened the noose on all potential intelligence leaks. A specific example of the tactical precision the resistance risked their lives to achieve was the continuous mapping of German troop movements in anticipation of the Allied invasion. The LOD's networks along the Rhine provided precise, real-time tracking of panzer and infantry divisions, information often smuggled out via fishing boats crossing the North Sea. This phase of the war revealed the true depth of the impossible stand. It was not a grand military endeavor, but a prolonged moral conflict played out in small dark rooms and anonymous streets. The ultimate calculation was not victory, but delaying the enemy, saving one more life, and ensuring that even in the face of certain death, the crucial line of intelligence and support did not break. The emotional and psychological compromise extracted by the occupation forces was the highest price of the resistance, but it was a cost paid willingly by those who understood that a defeated spirit was a far greater loss than a lost life. The autumn of 1944. The ground shivered, not from cold, but from the echoes of failed hope. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious Allied gamble to seize the Rhine bridges and end the war by Christmas, had ground to a bloody halt. In response to the Allied advance, and in a pivotal act of cooperation, the Dutch resistance had called for a national railway strike in September. Over 30,000 Dutch railway personnel walked off the job, an immediate and paralyzing strategic success that effectively halted the German war machine's logistical flow through the country. The German reprisal was swift, total, and utterly merciless. It was a calculated act of state-sponsored terror. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, signed the order to prohibit all rail traffic to the western provinces. Then, the regime banned all inland shipping, the primary historical artery for the distribution of foodstuffs. This was not collateral damage, it was the weaponization of logistics. The Germans deliberately severed the connection between the rich agricultural lands of the northeast and the densely populated urban belt of the west, the provinces of North and South Holland and Utrecht, where over 4 million Dutch citizens lived. The strategic irony here is devastating. The successful resistance act, the strike, became the direct trigger for the country's worst humanitarian catastrophe. As the winter of 1944-1945 descended, temperatures plummeted, and the official food rations dropped to a skeletal 400 to 800 calories per day. This reduction was medically deliberate, just enough to keep the heart beating, but insufficient to sustain life or physical work. The population of cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam was systematically starved into submission. The streets became a landscape of slow death. People scraped bark from trees, boiled tulip bulbs, tulpenbollen, for their meager starch content, and hunted stray animals. The average weight loss was 40 pounds per adult. The statistics are a cold memorial. An estimated 20,000 Dutch civilians perished directly from malnutrition and related diseases during this hunger winter. The impossible stand was forced into its final, most compassionate transformation. The LO, Landelijke Organisatie, originally built to hide the persecuted and distribute forged coupons, became a full-scale famine relief organization. Its networks, already honed by years of clandestine logistics, were now mobilized for the monumental task of feeding an entire starving populace. The resistance organized the hunger trips, Hongertochten. These were epic, desperate journeys undertaken by thousands, often the young and the relatively healthy, cycling or walking up to 100 miles into the eastern and northern provinces. They carried valuables, clothing, or furniture to barter directly with farmers for small sacks of potatoes or grain. The logistical nightmare was compounded by German checkpoints and the freezing conditions. Many who set out never returned, collapsing from exhaustion and hunger on the roadside, a testament to the monumental human cost of these supply lines. Simultaneously, the armed resistance groups engaged in a strategic high-stakes game of industrial theft. Relying on intelligence from railway workers who had remained secretly loyal, they targeted German trains carrying food and fuel supplies intended for the collapsing Western Front. These acts of strategic diversion were carried out with military precision, sabotaging the switches, overpowering the few guards and quickly distributing the stolen goods to predetermined drop zones. In one famous instance near Utrecht, an entire trainload of potatoes was successfully diverted, feeding a nearby town for weeks. This was not mere looting, it was highly organized, operational resource recovery under extreme duress. The final climactic act was the Allied humanitarian intervention. As the plight of the Dutch became known through high-risk radio transmissions, the Allies negotiated a temporary local ceasefire with the German command, led by General Blaskowitz, who, facing overwhelming defeat, agreed to the terms. This led to Operation Manna, British, and Operation Chowhound, American, the massive life-saving food airdrops. The successful execution of these operations was entirely dependent on the resistance intelligence network. Agents on the ground coordinated with Allied aircraft, flying dangerously low, sometimes at 200 feet above the rooftops, to avoid German flak. The resistance teams secured and marked the designated drop zones, often former airfields or large fields, using pre-arranged signals, giant white cloths, flares, or even bonfires, and crucially provided security perimeters to ensure the food parcels were not immediately seized by desperate German soldiers or opportunistic collaborators. Between April 29th and May 8, 1945, thousands of tons of K-rations, powdered milk and flour descended from the sky. This was the moment the civilian logistical network of the LO met the air power of the Allies in a unified humanitarian strategy. The ability of the Dutch people to survive the hunger winter, leveraging their established underground infrastructure to coordinate a global relief effort, proved that while the German military could wield famine as a weapon, it could not extinguish the organized collective will to survive. The final chapter of the impossible stand was a victory forged not in steel, but in the successful, monumental logistics of compassion. May 5, 1945, the silence after the engine roar. The instruments of surrender were signed in Wageningen. As the Canadian and British Liberation Forces rolled into the western cities, they were met with scenes of joyous, skeletal citizens, but also with an astonishing discovery. Where a conquered territory should have been consumed by chaos, they found a nation that had been secretly managing its own affairs. The civilians had not merely endured, they had successfully maintained a shadow state. The official post-war assessment by the Allied High Command, specifically those within SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was one of profound strategic astonishment. Generals, accustomed to evaluating the performance of armies, were forced to grapple with the success of a decentralized civilian-led resistance movement. This led directly to the now iconic, almost incredulous declaration, "The impossible stand no soldier expected." This was more than a tribute. It was a military acknowledgement that a civilian will, organized and sustained, could be a decisive strategic factor. The legacy of the Dutch resistance is a testament to asymmetrical warfare and is evident in three fundamental pillars of historical impact. 1. Strategic intelligence and operational precision. The strategic intelligence value delivered by the resistance was a force multiplier of incalculable worth. The tiny short-burst radio transmissions and the countless couriers delivering hand-drawn maps and documents provided the Allies with continuous, high-fidelity intelligence. This was the difference between an informed invasion and a catastrophic gamble. V-weapons. Resistance reports on the development sites and movements of the V-1 and V-2 rockets were crucial, enabling the Allies to prioritize the bombing of key launch and production facilities, directly reducing the technological threat to London and Antwerp. Atlantic Wall. Detailed schematics and placement of German coastal defences and beach obstacles, mapped meticulously by Dutch citizens, were vital for the tactical planning of the Normandy landings. The accuracy of this on-the-ground intelligence saved thousands of lives on D-Day and beyond. Operational support, the real-time intelligence during the final campaigns, mapping German troop concentrations and infrastructure vulnerabilities, directly informed the final pushes, including the strategic coordination of the life-saving food airdrops during the Hunger winter. 2. The technological mastery of survival. The technological masterpiece of survival lay not in weaponry, but in the sophisticated architecture of the NSF and the LO. This system demonstrated that an organized civilian network could financially and logistically support a vast persecuted population, including over 300,000 Onderdikers, for the duration of the 5-year occupation. The Paper War. The forging of identity papers, Personenbeweisen, was a continuous feat of technological deception, rendering the German bureaucratic control porous and unreliable. The ability to mass-produce undetectable forgeries proved that paper and ink could be more potent tools of disruption than explosives. Clandestine finance. The 80 million guilder theft by the NSF was an act of economic warfare disguised as financial fraud, sustaining the parallel society when all conventional financing was shut down. This financial logistics was a technological application of trust and deception at the highest level. 3. The foundation of modern governance. The model for post-war governance emerged directly from the ashes of the resistance. The internal political wings of the resistance, composed of engineers, clerks, and local leaders who had run the shadow state, provided a ready-made, organized, and morally validated structure. They transitioned immediately into municipal and provincial administration, bypassing the power vacuum that plagued many other liberated nations. Their shared experiences and moral authority became a unifying force, profoundly shaping the Netherlands' post-war political and social landscape. In conclusion, the story of the Dutch resistance is a timeless lesson in the power of the human element against overwhelming force. The deep irony remains: the German blitzkrieg strategy, designed for a swift conventional victory, inadvertently created the conditions for a pervasive, decentralized, and ultimately unconquerable form of civilian resistance. The Netherlands was militarily defeated in 4 days, but it was never truly conquered. The ground gained by the Wehrmacht was constantly undermined by the quiet, impossible stand of its people, who refused to be ruled, choosing instead the terrifying, beautiful path of the shadow war. It is their resilience, the clerks, the students, the housewives, the bankers, that defines the true strategic spirit of the Netherlands during World War II, a testament to the fact that the greatest strategic asset in any conflict is an unbroken human heart. Thank you for exploring this profound chapter of history with us. If this detailed look into the Shadow War and technological defiance resonated with you, please ensure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these meticulously researched and untold stories of courage to light.